Inanna was the ruler of sex and victory, which the Sumerians and the Akkadians saw as interconnected. I mean, who doesn't get aroused by conquest, am I right? This is Saturn, girl. And we have a brief but very important transit happening in just a few days. On June the 4th, Venus, my mommy, and Our Lady of Love will unite with the Sun in a conjunction. In fact, this is called the superior conjunction, and it's a momentous event in the wider Venus cycle. In this video, I'm going to talk about what the superior conjunction is, what it means, the symbolism behind it, and how it applies to your life personally by doing your horoscopes for the occasion. So make sure you watch all the way to the end. But first, why is this so important? You see, it's the midway point of the Venus Synodic cycle, or the beginning, depending on who you ask. But what is a synodic cycle? It has to do with a planet's relationship to the sun. That is, the time it takes from one conjunction with the sun to the next one. For planets closer to the sun than the Earth, like Venus and Mercury, there are actually two of these conjunctions, but we'll talk more about that in a bit. First, let's look at the fun chart, shall we? See, here we are. My mommy is approaching the sun. Let's go forward just a few days. And then, boom! Look at that. Venus has entered the heart of the sun. Or maybe it's the sun that entered Venus. Remember that in astrology, we are symbolically interpreting astronomical phenomena, and we can understand the astronomy as a symbol for our personal growth and development. In my own practice, I've realized that each planet's synodic cycle indicates a particular journey in consciousness that relates both to mythology and our daily experiences. And a lot of mythology is about conveying philosophical and moral lessons. In this case, the Venus cycle has to do with relationships, as well as the relationship between dependence and independence. One of my heroes, Demetra George, shows us the connection between the Venus synodic cycle and the Sumerian myth of my mama Inanna entering the underworld. She talks about this in one of her appearances on the astrology podcast with Chris Brennan. I suggest everyone watch this episode. It's very good, and I'm going to put a link to it in the description below. She even talks about how the Barbie movie follows the same basic plotline as the Inanna story. It's really wild, and I'll mention a little bit more about that as we go on. But first, who was Inanna? She's my mommy and the original Venus. Here we have a relief image of her from an ancient Akkadian cylinder seal from about 2200 BCE. That's over 4,000 years ago. She's the daughter of the Sumerian moon god, Inanna, and became the patron deity of the ancient Mesopotamian city of Uruk, situated in modern-day Iraq. In fact, Iraq was named for Uruk. She was the goddess of both love and war, but she had nothing to do with marriage or motherhood. Inanna was the ruler of sex and victory, which the Sumerians and the Akkadians saw as interconnected. I mean, who doesn't get aroused by conquest, am I right? We may refer to her as a goddess, but Inanna's gender was often ambiguous. In fact, she was said to have the power to change men into women and women into men. Cuneiform tablets going back around 4,500 years depict transgender priests and priestesses dedicated to Inanna, referred to as Gala or Gala. They may have been born biologically male or female, but they lived as a gender contrary to their biological sex. They were known as healers and singers of sorrowful songs. Many of them even had families and children. Now, in astrology, we know that Venus has primarily come to rule love, desire, pleasure, and relationships. Not just romantic relationships, but our whole social nature. Inanna, on the other hand, was more impetuous, independent, aggressive, sexually dominant, and she even craved power, which we're going to see both in her myth and in the symbolism of the Venus cycle. So now let's look at the astronomy. This diagram depicts the stages of the Venus cycle from Demetra George's indispensable work, Ancient Astrology, Volume 1. Each stage on this diagram is indicated by a letter, A through H. Astronomically, the cycle begins with what's called the inferior conjunction and Venus retrograde. But in terms of my mama's myth, it really should start at the superior conjunction. Now, as we said earlier, Venus is closer to the sun than the Earth. So she's never more than 48 degrees away from the sun astrologically. This means that she can't ever really form a traditional aspect with the sun. That is, a trine, sextile, square, or opposition. She can only form a conjunction. But similar to the moon, we can divide her cycle up into stages or phases. Let's briefly enumerate what those phases are. First, we start off with A, the inferior conjunction. Yes. Then we go to B, the morning rise, or the direct station. Then we go to C, the maximum elongation towards the west. And then we go to the morning set, which is D. Then we reach E, the superior conjunction, which we're about to hit now. Then we go to F, the evening rise, right? And then we get to G, the maximum elongation west. And then we go to H, right? Which is the evening set and the retrograde station. We're going to discuss what each of these phases mean in just a moment. But before that, we need to look at the myth of my mama Inanna and her descent into the underworld. And a quick spoiler alert, I'm going to make references to the Barbie movie in this, so if you haven't seen it, beware. So the story starts with my mama blissfully hanging out in her heavenly realm with her husband, Dumuzid. I think I'm saying that correctly, Dumuzid. Sort of like the beginning of the Barbie movie, right? Like, isn't this great? Then, just like Barbie, she begins to contemplate death. Inanna then decides to enter the underworld, the realm of the dead, ruled by her sister Ereshkigal. As Inanna, approaches, Ereshkigal tells her minions to close the 7 gates leading to the underworld, but to leave them partly open, and demand that each of her ornaments of power be removed, like her headdress, her lapis lazuli necklace, and her other jewelry, in order to enter each gate. Inanna is progressively stripped of her power during this journey and is laid bare and naked before her sister. My mommy usually likes stripping, but this wasn't the fun kind. She was stripped of her pride and her pretense. Yet in a display of her craving for power, she gets up and sits on her sister's throne. As a consequence, 7 judges condemn my mama to death. She's to be turned into a corpse and hung from a meat hook, and she remains there for 3 days. Sound familiar? Perhaps a little bit Christ-like? Overcome with sorrow, Inanna's loyal servant pleads with the other gods to help her, but they all refuse, saying, well, it's her own damn fault. But the god Enki, lord of water and creation, realizes that without Inanna, ain't no one gonna be getting down. Ain't no one gonna be making no babies. Ain't nothing gonna grow, right? There's no birds and the bees, right? Pollination. Human pollination. You may recognize a similar plotline to the later story of Persephone, but more of that comes up later. So in response to her pleas, Enki creates a couple of servants and tells them to go to hell and sprinkle the food and water of life on my poor mommy. They negotiate with Ereshkigal to retrieve Inanna's corpse. Once they arrive, Ereshkigal is already having a bad time. So they're able to convince her relatively quickly, and then sprinkle all their divine Scooby snacks on her. Inanna is revived, and then ready to bounce out of there like a bat out of hell. But then some demons say that she can't go without leaving someone else to take her place. The demons go after each of her servants, but they were faithfully mourning her. So she tells the demons to fuck off. But then they see her husband Dumuzid, and he's having a great old time. He's sitting on her throne, surrounded by loads of slave girls, entertaining him. He's obviously not mourning. In fact, he seems pretty happy. Sort of reminds me of Ken taking over Barbie's dream house, doesn't it? Then Inanna's all like, yo, demons, you can take this motherfucker over here. And just like that, Dumuzid gets his ass dragged to hell. My mommy Inanna is free. She's independent, and she gets to bask in her warrior queen glow. But then she starts to pity him and even miss him. So Inanna and her sister-in-law strike a deal where Dumuzid will spend half the year in the underworld and the other half with Inanna. Meanwhile, while he's with Inanna, his sister will take his place for that half of the year in the underworld. And Inanna and Dumuzid are reunited like the sun and Venus. I mean, if that doesn't sound like the forerunner to the Hades and Persephone myth, I don't know what does. But the really cool and practical thing is that we can relate the basic stages of the Inanna myth to the phases of the Venus cycle. We can also relate those to your personal life by birth and in transit. The evening star half of the cycle, which you can see here at the bottom, is considered Inanna or Venus as her feminine expression, the goddess of pleasure, love, and relationships. Here she longs for romance and enjoyment. People born while Venus is in the evening star phase tend to be more oriented towards desire and relationships. Meanwhile, the morning star portion up here is where Venus is at her most masculine expression, the goddess of war, victory, and rebirth. Here she relishes her newfound freedom after breaking the bonds that previously held her. People born while Venus is in the morning star phase tend to be more independent and self-directed. But let's see how each of these phases relate to this story and to your own life. We're beginning here with A, the inferior conjunction, because that's where astronomers and astrologers place the beginning and ending of the Venus cycle. But the story really should begin with the superior conjunction and my mommy's marriage. So you see, the inferior conjunction is when Venus passes between the Earth and the Sun. This always happens when Venus is moving retrograde, and Demetra George likens this to the Sun and Venus being ripped away from each other. And this is Inanna being stripped of all she holds dear and left to die at her lowest point in hell. People born under this phase long for freedom, and they don't like commitments typically. They reject convention and the past. And then we move to B. This is the morning rise, right? When Venus separates from the Sun after stationing direct, and she emerges in visibility once again. This is her clawing her way out of death and bondage to be reborn. She's turned away from what she once held dear, and she looks ahead towards her own ambitions. These people are somewhat solitary and independent. They're suspicious of others and tradition, and they don't like being told what to do. And then we get to C. This is the maximum elongation to the west, with Venus approaching her brightest, and is therefore Inanna at the height of her power as the warrior goddess. People born under this phase tend to be more assertive, independent, and free-spirited. They can be cold, selfish, obstinate, and uncompromising. Their passions often supersede their relationships. Well, and then let's move on to D. This is the morning set, when Venus moves closer to the Sun and becomes less visible, signifying that Inanna is starting to feel something is missing once again. She begins to crave love and affection, of course. So people born under this phase may seem a bit lonely. They're still independent, but they want connection, like introverted extroverts, yeah? Social situations can be scary, but they still crave the attention. Well, then we move on to E, which is really the proper beginning of the story, right? The superior conjunction, which is the phase when Venus reunites with the Sun, but this time they're moving direct. Whereas before, the Sun and Venus were separating, this time they're moving in the same direction. This represents Inanna ending her independent phase and moving to reunite with her consort or husband once again. These people can tend to be romantics, charming, attractive. Yet the independent and self-directed tendencies are often still below the surface. Well, and then we move on to F, right, which is the evening rise, when Venus separates from the Sun and becomes visible again as the evening star. Remember that she's visible within 15 degrees either way of the Sun. This is Inanna entering her honeymoon phase. She learns to appreciate desire and enjoy herself. These people can be fun, naive, but also awkward and concerned with what people think about them. Then we get to G, right? This is my phase, when Venus separates to her furthest distance from the Sun, her maximum elongation, but this time in the eastern sky. This is Inanna approaching her brightest, right? The height of her desirability, luxury, and pleasure, just like me. She's blissfully unaware that she's given away her identity. And those, like me, born under this phase, want beautiful people and things, right? At best, we're the life of the party, attractive, flirtatious, and magnetic. At worst, we're arrogant, hedonistic, codependent, and, dare I say, lazy? Well, then we get to H, where we finally hit the evening set, just before Venus stations retrograde once again. This is where she gets close enough to the Sun and sets with him in the evening. When Venus gets close enough, she stations retrograde and becomes invisible once again. This is Inanna's beginning of her descent into the underworld. She's grown weary of desire and pleasure and begins to contemplate death, right? People born under this phase are more reflective and conscientious. They're sociable yet detached, and like extroverted introverts, right? The other way. Perhaps there's a sense of dissatisfaction. Well, and then we reach the inferior conjunction once again, right? So after contemplating death, then we go back into the underworld and start the whole cycle over. And now we're approaching the superior conjunction once again, which I said earlier is really the beginning of Inanna's story. This phase has to do with both Inanna's marriage and reunion with her husband, as we just said. You can see how it relates to our romantic relationships in our lives, and also our dependence on others and their dependence on us. There's a sense of blissful ignorance and naivety. Of course, the conjunction is taking place in Gemini, and there's definitely an airy, active, and mercurial quality to it. The Sun and Venus moving in the same direction indicates a reliance on others, an appreciation of pleasure and enjoyment, being receptive and trusting in others. Together, they shine a light on a particular issue or conflict that arose during the previous Venus cycle. Jupiter is now in Gemini too, and it's like the Sun and Venus are showing you what the deal is, while Jupiter is giving you the encouragement to resolve it over the following year. The house that the conjunction is placed in for you shows where you are getting support and who you may be reconciling with or relying on. Yes, new romantic relationships could arise, but more importantly, the house placement sets the tone for how the rest of this Venus cycle will go, which lasts for 584 days, or approximately 1.6 years. How will this affect you? Well, let's find out by doing your horoscopes for the occasion. Remember that these horoscopes are done by rising sign, so we can see which houses are being highlighted. But let's start with Aries Rising, shall we? Our Aries Rising Hermes. So you see, the conjunction is happening in the third house of siblings, community, communication, extended family. So perhaps there's a need for reunion with siblings or extended family or your community. We often see speaking and writing that encourages unity, reconciliation, and mutual understanding. We may also get good news. The third house is news, of course, right? The media we consume. We could express our knowledge to others in a constructive way. And it's also about recognizing our relationship with our local community once again, participating within it, however that looks to you. But let's move on to our Taurus Rising siblings, our Taurus Rising Hermes. And this is the second house, you see, of our stuff and our material resources. So it's like Venus and the Sun are revealing your relationship to your stuff. This could entail enjoying nice things, right? An appreciation of what you have, but also being more careful and judicious with your resources. You're recognizing the value of what you have. And remember, the things you own can end up owning you if we're not careful. But let's move on to our Gemini Rising Hermes. So for Gemini, this is your first house of self and can represent a reunion with yourself, your path, your dharma, what you feel like your purpose is, right? Whereas the 12th house here sort of deconstructs us, takes us apart. The conjunction in your first house, along with Jupiter being there, is about putting you back together. It's the recognition of your virtues and becoming aware of how your behavior affects other people. Remember, you're not an island. But anyway, let's move on to our Cancer Rising Hermes. So for Cancer Rising, this is the 12th house of self-undoing, right? Mental illness or mental health and things like addiction and substances and all that. So as I said earlier, the 12th house is about deconstruction. Venus and the Sun reveal self-destructive habits and behaviors, not only that hurt us, but those around us and who we care about as well. This isn't necessarily a pleasant thing, but we do get faced with parts of ourselves that we'd rather not see. Then we get the Jupiterian inspiration to bring our behavior in line with our values and who we really want to be. But let's move on to our Leo Rising Hermes. So for Leo Rising, this is the 11th house of hopes and friends, supporters. This is sort of like the Beatles song, right? I get by with a little help from my friends. I get from a little help from my friends. The Sun and Venus show us how we need the help of those who believe in us, who share our ideas and values, and that it's very useful to have people who support us. Because once again, you can't do the work on your own. We all need each other, right? We all need somebody to lean on me. But anyway, let's move on to our Virgo Rising Hermes. So for Virgo Rising, this is the 10th house of career, life direction, right? So this is a light shining on your past accomplishments or perhaps failures, right? And it encourages us to strive for new goals over the next year. Perhaps we were dissatisfied with what we've done and realize a new endeavor or path that is more in line with our values. This is sort of like the bright light of the Sun and Venus reflected right through our own radiation. But let's move on to Libra Rising. Our Libra Rising Hermes. So this is the 9th house here of our beliefs, our spirituality, right? And wisdom. So Venus and the Sun are showing us here where you may have been too rigid and dogmatic in the past. They can also show you new and more inclusive ways of thinking and looking at the world. The following year might be one of discovery and new understandings. You may even meet a teacher or a mentor. You see, wisdom emerges as we realize new connections. But let's move on to Scorpio Rising. So for Scorpio Rising, you see Gemini is the 8th house here of other people's stuff, of debt, death, all that sort of thing. I even put forgiveness there. And to me, Venus and the Sun are revealing past hurts and conflicts that we've probably carried around like luggage or sexually transmitted infections. And resentment is sort of like an infection, isn't it? And you're recognizing the medicine of forgiveness that is needed here. You'll become aware of a conflict that may need resolution. And the following year will be about learning to let go, right? Let it go, let it go. Turn away and shut the door. I don't care what they're going to say. Anyway, I won't go on with that. My daughter would yell at me for singing that. Let's go to our Snagi-ma-ttarius Rising, Hermes. So for Sagittarius Rising, we see the 7th house here of romantic partnerships highlighted. Well, so for you, right, it's romantic relationships. But the 7th house also rules opponents and challengers. And sometimes our partners become opponents and challengers, don't they? The Sun and Venus that we're showing you where you can strengthen your romantic partnership, or they can show you where you strengthen yourself so you can be happy and not anxious in a romantic partnership. Sometimes we actually need a new partner, but oftentimes we renew our current partnership. But let's move on to Crapricorn Rising. Our Crapricorn Rising friends. Now this puts Gemini in the 6th house of injuries, illnesses, obligations, all that sort of stuff. So it's like the Sun and Venus are shining a light on health issues and obligations that need your attention. Remember that the 6th house is like, it's all this stuff that falls apart when we don't take care of it. So it's likely that you've avoided some responsibilities and need to get yourself in order. You're going to see what it is that you let fall by the wayside, and also get the motivation to start working on these things over the coming year. But let's move on to Aquariumus Rising. Our Aquariumus Rising Hermes, right? This is me. And the 5th house is highlighted of sex and children. So it's like the sun is shining a light on our relationships to our children, our sense of fun and pleasure, and our sex lives. If you have kids, this is indicating you that you need to put more of your attention on them. They need more of your attention. And the coming year should be about spending more time with them and sharing common interests. This should also be a year where you allow yourself to have fun again. If you're anything like me, then fun is doing grown-up stuff with other grown-ups. Sometimes more than one. Simultaneously. But anyway, let's move on to Pisces Rising. So for Pisces Rising, Gemini is the 4th house of the home, the family, the past, the father, right? So for you, the Sun and Venus are shining a light on your past, or perhaps issues from your parents that you've held on to. Revelations about your heritage or reconciliation with a parent will likely renew your sense of connection to your family and your past. This is also a time where you could very literally look at improving your living situation, an apartment or a house or whatever. You could also receive a gift from your parents, particularly your father, maybe even posthumously, which could help stabilize your situation over the following year. Well, anyway, I hope that was useful for you. Please make sure you like this video, subscribe to my channel, and comment below because I want to know what you think, and it helps me out with the algorithm. Please also click the bell when you subscribe so that you get notified when my new videos drop. And my videos are the best. Please also consider tipping me. You can give through Super Thanks below, or you can find my PayPal and Patreon links in the description. Remember, this keeps me going, making such wonderful content. And I'm very cute, and I'm very funny, and I know my stuff. So please help a sister out. And if you can't give, then just watch all my videos, all the way through, including the commercials. Then you don't have to pay me. The advertisers do. Also, I do the best readings. It's science. You can book through my website, frankielynch.com, or use my contact information below to get at me directly. But most importantly, I love you. You're beautiful. and have a spectacular whatever it is you're having.